the statistics showed that 72% of the victims of shelling in Donbass between 2016 and 2018 were on the separatist side, in other terms caused by Ukraine. For me, there was a before and an after, because once you read this document and that you accept that it is true, it changes completely how you perceive the war in Donbass and the war in Ukraine as we see now. So that's why I spend time referring to it, because for me, this document is fundamental to understand how everything started. And everything started with a false flag attack of the most cynical kind. They were ready to sacrifice their own supporters to create a massive scandal that would, in the end, ultimately end up with the dismissal of the elected president, Yanukovych. And I asked him, well, aren't you interested to dig into it, to make up your own mind whether it's legitimate or not, and I had briefed him on what it was about in a couple of sentences. So he knew what it was about. And once I asked him, well, are you interested to dig into it? He said, well, no, it would change too many things. So this is when I understood you cannot trust mainstream press.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Ich zeige Ihnen Positionen und Perspektiven, welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen. Mein heutiger Gast war Beobachter der Organisation für Entwicklung und Zusammenarbeit in Europa im Donbass, im Kriegsgebiet, und zwar in den Jahren 2015 bis 2022. Er hat darüber ein Buch geschrieben, dieses Buch, What I Saw in Ukraine. Und was Benoît Paré dort gesehen hat, unterscheidet sich erheblich von dem, was uns die Presse hierzulande erzählt. Welcome, Benoît Paré. When did you find out that the media narrative is completely different to the situation on the ground?
Talking about Ukraine.
Yes.
I would say mostly from 2016. 2016, for me, is a key year because this is the year I finally read the study from Ivan Kachanovsky, this university professor of the University of Ottawa in Canada. He's a Ukrainian national initially, and he actually studied all the videos he could find about the events around what we call the Maidan massacre, which occurred between 19 February 2014. This is where the whole crisis that we now still see unfolding started. That's the Maidan coup. Now, in the Western media, back then, it was presented as a romantic revolution of the united Ukrainian people against a nasty, corrupted, pro-Russian president. And, I didn't have any other explanation to around to have to think otherwise until I found this study from Ivan Kachanovsky. First, I saw it from an article in Sputnik, this Russian newspaper, which is now forbidden in Europe. And because when I was working with the OSCE, we had press digest done by our mission every day. So every morning I started my day by basically going through the headlines of the press digest, and it was pretty well done because we were covering the Ukrainian press, of course, but not only. We were also covering the Russian press and the separatist press, as well as some of the major press outlets in the Western world. But it was mostly, let's say, Ukraine, Russian, and separatists. And so this is where I found an article about this study of Ivan Kachanovsky in Sputnik. But, I was trained. I mean, we were all trained in the West to think that everything that comes from Russia is propaganda. So, of course, I had to go to the source. So pretty quickly, I managed to get a hold of the thesis of Ivan Kachanovsky. which I downloaded from the website of the University of Ottawa. But I was a bit intimidated by it because it was 72 pages long. Plus, it relied upon a series of videos, which at that time, and we're talking about, I think it was fall, autumn 2015 when I discovered this document. And as far as I recall, the videos were not translated into English. Were not subtitled. They were in original language, either Russian or Ukrainian. So I felt I couldn't judge the primary source to have a better opinion about whether this is reliable or not, whether the study was reliable or not. So I waited for a long time before I actually digged into it. I read the introduction and then the conclusion, but even though it was like dramatic in terms of its conclusion, I was still not convinced because I didn't know whether it was genuine. So I had to wait, as I said, until I was assigned to Mariupol. Why? Because when I was assigned to Mariupol, somehow at some point I had some time to look into it, and I asked some of the interpreters that I had with the OSCE to to verify some key videos that Kachanovsky had referred to, just to double check that the translation was correct. And the interpreters confirmed to me that the interpretation was correct. So therefore, from that moment on, I thought, okay, I can read the whole thing uh, and make up my own mind, which I did. And then it was basically, for me, there was a before and an after. Because once you read this document and that you accept that it is true, then it changes completely how you perceive the war in Donbass and the war in Ukraine as we see now. So that's why I spend time referring to it, because for me, this document is fundamental to understand how everything started. And everything started with a false flag attack uh, of the most cynical kind, right? Because basically, what it means is that the opposition, now who exactly remains to be found, discovered someday, but we have some pretty good idea, and that the people who were controlling different buildings, opposition people, they were ready to sacrifice their own supporters to create a massive scandal that would, in the end, ultimately end up with the dismissal of the elected president, Yanukovych. So they used cynically these people by killing them, hoping this would never be discovered. But when you look for some things, and when you're gifted like Kachanovsky, well, you can find the truth. And he demonstrated what happened. And I even had one of my colleagues afterwards to have a look into it. This colleague of mine had a long career in the um, Italian police, let's say. And after he read the whole thesis, he told me this is like a police investigation. And this is a demonstration. There's no, you present that in court. And normally you win the case. Um, so for him, it was very convincing. The problem is that no major media outlets in the Western world ever mentioned this document. It's totally taboo, of course, because it changes the whole narrative if you um, if you take it into account. And actually, talking about that, at some point I had a chance to meet a journalist, a French journalist of the mainstream media in Ukraine, and I mentioned this document to him. And I asked him, well, aren't you interested to dig into it, to make up your mind whether it's legitimate or not? And I had briefed him on what it was about, right? In a couple of sentences. So he knew what it was about. And once I asked him, well, are you interested to dig into it? He said, well, no, it would change too many things. So this is when I understood you cannot trust mainstream press. And I'm talking about a newspaper that is highly regarded in my country, in France, as a paper of reference. There's only like 3 national newspapers in France, only 3. So it's one of the 3, right? Uh, I was asked by this person who introduced me to this journalist, not to mention his name in order not to embarrass him for life. So, as a matter of respect for this friend who introduced us, I decided not to mention the name of the person. But if one day this newspaper is attacking me, I will reveal the name. And but so far they prefer to ignore me, like they prefer to ignore Kachanowski. This is how the mainstream media work. What you cannot um, deny, just ignore. This is how it works. Um, so, yeah, that's the answer to your question. When I realized
Yes. And one year later you showed up. 1 year later you showed up in the Donbass. And what was your first experience? What did you see?
I showed up in the Donbass before that. I ended up in Ukraine in July 2015. I started to work in Donbass from 1st of August 2015. First in Donetsk for like initial training for like 2 weeks, and then I was deployed to Kramatorsk for 1 year. And from Kramatorsk, I was able to also to visit Gorlovka at the northern part of the DPR, because at some point we took over that part, but we were going there on a rotation basis. Then I moved to Mariupol for 2 years and 4 months. It's the same in Mariupol. I had also the chance to visit the southern part of the Donetsk People's Republic. And then I was reassigned to, at my own initiative, actually. I was reassigned to Lugansk Oblast, Lugansk City, to see what it was over there and the other oblast and on the other side of the line of contact on a longer term basis. And I also had a chance to travel in the Lugansk Oblast on the other side as well in Severodonetsk a couple of times. Also in Stanislav because there was a pedestrian bridge back then that we could use as OSCE observers and to monitor what was going on there. So that basically just briefly all the different places that I've seen in Donbass. And whenever I was assigned to these different places, I was going all over the place. I probably visited 80% of all the villages in Donbass that were along the line of contact. It's not that I knew them all, but pretty big part of them, especially in the Donetsk Oblast. So, whenever I hear the news today about what's going on, this village was taken, destroyed, whatever, I all know all these places. Um, I've been there. I have memories in almost every single place. And many of his memories are mentioned in my book, by the way. But so what was your question exactly? Sorry, I missed. Mm.
I just wanted to hear something about your first experiences in Kramatorsk and the places you visited. You talked to a lot of locals. What did they tell you?
Well, indeed, I talked to so many people, hundreds. And I talked to, I was interested in politics before I was deployed there. In previous OSCE missions, I was dealing with local mayors, um, people in charge of local governance. So I was always interested to talk to these people because I realized when you understand how local governance works, you understand a lot about the functioning of a country. And also, you talk to people who are well connected and who know what's going on the ground. And at the same time, they're not at the central level. So it's very interesting to talk to these people because they're more accessible than, let's say, ministers. And they will tell you more things that people of higher levels. So it's a better way to understand a country, I think. And also, I would talk to average people because on patrols, we were supposed to talk to average people you meet in the street, people who come to you. Um, I talked to also military people, soldiers, checkpoints. Whenever I had a chance to glean some information, I would like to ask them, so where do you come from? What motivates you? Things like that, to have a better understanding. So when you talk to all these different people, also lawyers, because at some point I was following court hearings, so I talked to many lawyers, prosecutors as well. Judges, not so much because we're like a bit hard to reach. But people from very different professions and background. So different people would tell you different things. But from all my trips along the line of contact, I would say the main thing that I gathered was that most people living in Donbass on the government control side, Ukrainian government control side of Donbass, were very much angry at the Ukrainian armed forces. If there was one military force that was perceived locally as an occupation force, it was by far the Ukrainian armed forces, by far. There's no comparison. Because then I went on the other side, on the DPR side, LPR side, and the people you meet at checkpoints are locals. They are people who live in the village next door or in the city next door, right? Or they are anywhere from Donbass, the furthest you go. Apart from a few people actually in the DPR, I met one guy who was from Odessa, member from a communist party. There was another guy who was from Zaporizhia Oblast. But everybody else I talked to, well, one guy was from Moldova. I remember he was a bit a volunteer from Moldova. But everybody else I talked to said they were from Donbass, and sometimes from the part of Donbass still that was actually you could say occupied from the point of view by the Ukrainian military. So like I met guys, soldiers from Kramatorsk, soldiers from Mariupol, but when they evacuated these cities, they actually followed the DPR, and it meant that for them, they could not see their relatives for years. So that was the reality of these people. But if you consider the civilians I talked to, again, from around Mariupol all the way to north of Donetsk, near Bakhmut, all these people hated the Ukrainian military. I mean, I wouldn't say all, but the majority. I describe a scene in my book, well, several scenes actually. First time I visited a village near the line of contact, near Bakhmut, the people were so mad at the Ukrainian military. It was amazing because the Ukrainian military had decided to occupy the kindergarten in that very village, which made the people mad because they said if they come here, it means the kindergarten will become a legitimate target for the DPR forces and they will shell the village. And then if they shell the school, where will our children go to school in September? Because that was in August, just like a couple of weeks before school started. So they were very angry and mad. And then when I went to another village in winter, north of Donetsk, same. The people erupted in anger against the Ukrainian armed forces when they saw me, because they said for them they were responsible of everything that went wrong to them. Uh, they said they behaved like occupation forces, scaring everyone. Basically looting houses, destroying infrastructure by building trenches. Then also, one anecdote, for instance, they said a soldier jumped into the school bus with his gun to threaten the kids. Uh, you know, so people were very shocked by that. Um, and same thing in Mariupol. There was a checkpoint east of Mariupol, and all the people living beyond this checkpoint, because of contact and this checkpoint, even kids to go to school, they had to go through a military checkpoint, and they were harassed. Kids, the soldiers would enter the buses and basically search everyone, whatever the age, from kids to grand babushkas. So that made people really angry. Uh, and the soldiers were basically trained to believe that, all the people in Donbass are traitors, would be terrorists, so that they had to, you know, everybody was suspicious for them. But they say after a while, they would calm down after maybe 2 weeks, and then there would be another rotation, and then a new cycle of um, how can I say, improper behavior would occur once again. So it was a recurring event. And I'm talking about daily life stuff here, right? Things that never made headline news. I've encountered much more serious problems than that. But all these little things of daily life were contributing to make people resent deeply the Ukrainian military. But you would never see that in a newspaper article because, there were no um Western journalists that I know of that ever actually mentioned such stories. Even in our reports, it was not mentioned. I mean, we mentioned such things in our patrol reports at the base level, that because it was considered too minor or just hearsay, as the people from reporting would say, "Oh, this is just hearsay." But people say things, we have no proof, we were not there to witness it, so we cannot use it, so it doesn't exist, right? So there was so much information which helped you to know what was going on, what the people felt. The Americans call that atmospherics. When I was in Afghanistan, it's completely different uh, context, you could say. But the American military had created little teams of civilians. They called HTT, Humanitarian Team, and I worked with them in Afghanistan. And this HTT, Humanitarian Team, was supposed to gather what they call atmospherics. Basically, it was a way to measure the temperature of how the US troops, ISAF, the NATO troops, were perceived by the local population. They thought it was important to consult the feelings of the local population, right? But the OSCE completely neglected that dimension. The OSCE thought it doesn't matter. We're here to check facts, not hearsay. So all this dimension that helps you to understand what's going on, but helps you to understand what people think, was totally ignored by the OSCE. I think this is one of the major flaws of our missions. But some people will say, well, it's not in the mandate. Okay, it's not strictly in the mandate, but nothing prevented us from, doing it as well. Except that I think people higher, they knew that if you do that, you will expose the fact that these people um, didn't like the state of Ukraine. So, and it would be against the narrative that of the Russian aggression, that what's going on in Donbass is just a Russian aggression, that the Donbass people are just waiting for the liberation of the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian armed forces, so that they are free from the evil Russians. This was the narrative. I'm not even caricaturing. Uh, this is not a caricature. What I'm saying now, some people really stated that in those days. Some people even believe that. Uh, I know Ukrainian people who are not from Donbass, who are elsewhere. I talk to them sometimes when we met in Kyiv during seminars and stuff. And some people really thought like that. And if you told them otherwise, they would tell you, "Oh, you're brainwashed because you have Stockholm syndrome," things like that. They wouldn't hear the truth. Didn't want to hear it. So many people didn't want to hear what went against their own beliefs.
When I investigated on the ground, for example, in Mariupol, in the completely destroyed Mariupol, years later, I heard the same stories. Many people blamed the Ukraine armed forces. And they told me they were tortured, they were detained, and all that. Would you say that this was a method of the Ukraine armed forces to suppress people in Donbass?
Well, I wouldn't say suppress people. Like some people say there was a genocide. I mean, for me, genocide is a strong word, right? Uh, I wouldn't use the word genocide for what happened there. But talking about arresting people, torturing them, well, it depends whom. I mean, if you just do behave normally, you don't talk about your political opinions, you could have a perfectly normal life in Mariupol, you know? Life from the outside looked perfectly normal if you are not dealing with politics. But if you were on the wrong side of politics, it was a totally different story. So I know by talking to different people, like people from the opposition bloc, the main political party in Donbass, that from 2015, I talked to many of them when I was in Kramatorsk, because I was working on the upcoming elections. And they could not. I mean, the candidate for mayor in Kramatorsk could not even run as a candidate because her credit card was blocked by the bank. And when she asked what's going on, they said, "Oh, we don't know." And then somebody told her, "Well, actually, if you step down from the candidacy for the mayor position, then maybe it will solve the problem." And so she stepped down, and miraculously, her credit card worked. So, who knows about that, now? And then when I moved to Mariupol, I talked to people in Mariupol, and they said that it was in 2016 or 17, 16 or 17, I can't remember the year, but the detail are in my books. They tried to organize petitions like signature gathering on one of the main boulevards in Mariupol, with tents, and they were trying to defend the Russian language, for instance, or another time I forgot what the issue was about, but something related. And it was only a matter of minutes before they got attacked by masked men who destroyed the tent that they were working in, and then uh,
Ich spreche mit Benoît Paré, dem Autor des Buches What I Saw in Ukraine. Benoît Paré war Beobachter der Organisation für Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa im Donbass in den Jahren 2015 bis 2022. Wir haben das Gespräch begonnen in Lissabon. Dort brach die Internetverbindung zusammen und wir setzen es hier in Berlin fort. Hello, Benoît. Welcome back. You talked many things. You told me many things about your appearance in Kramatorsk. What did you see in Kramatorsk that was completely different from the media narrative?
mhm. Well, I arrived in Kramatorsk in August 2015. And it was still pretty tense along the line of contact in those days, in spite of the Minsk agreement. And pretty quickly, I joined a unit which was called the Human Dimension Unit within the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. And as part of that unit, I was able to deal with human rights issues that we were confronted with in Donbass. But before actually getting into that specific topic of human rights violations, I can say that for the first 2 weeks, I was assigned to different patrols along the line of contact just to have to discover the area and to actually also patrol with each different patrol group that we had in Kramatorsk, because the base had 4 different patrol groups. So I patrolled with them all. So that gave me a chance to discover villages along the line of contact all over the place. And from the very first patrol in this Kramatorsk area, it was in the village of Kordumivka, I remember. We encountered the patrol leader and I, because I was not the patrol leader, that there was the deputy patrol leader as a newcomer. And we discovered in this village of Kordumivka an intense anger from the local inhabitants against the Ukrainian military, because the Ukrainian military just moved in the local kindergarten just to settle there. And that made the local population very upset, because they were afraid that from then on, the village, could be subject to shelling from the DPR side, meaning the Donetsk People's Republic side. And then we had a discussion with one woman who was living there. And she basically said, well, I have my sister on the other side of the line of contact, because we were like maybe 10 kilometers away from the line of contact in those days in this village, roughly. And she said, we exchange a lot whenever there are explosions in the area. We call each other and we try to assess what's going on. And she said, and this has been going on for about a year, by then, even more. And she said, now we figured out how it works. And according to them, the dynamic of the conflict those days was that the Ukrainian military would shell almost randomly on the other side, whereas the DPR forces would shell aiming at specific military targets. Now, that was not me saying that, that was her, based on the communication she had with her own sister living just on the other side. Okay, so you could say that's just one person's opinion or 2 people's opinions. That doesn't create, a reality that is necessarily intangible, and that you cannot contest. But for our first patrol, I realized that this was heavily against the narrative that we were fed with until then in the West, which is that the conflict in Donbass was just a Russian aggression, right? And all of a sudden, we have local people who tell us otherwise. So then when we went back to the base with my colleague and I, we were wondering, well, what do we do with this testimony? And my colleague, who was from one Eastern European country, he was a policeman by training. He was still a policeman by that time, actually. He was just detached in the OSCE mission. And he told me, you know what? I have bad experience telling the truth to a hierarchy that doesn't want to hear it because it goes against the narrative it defends. So if we publish what we just heard, I'm afraid we will get into trouble with our management. Our management will basically cause trouble to us. He said, I've already been through that in my own country, and I don't want to repeat that. So I do not want to report on such thing. So, and then I was just a newcomer, and I agreed with him. Okay, let's not report about it, because also I thought, well, anyway, it's just one testimony. You know, you cannot generalize from one testimony. We were told that every information you get on the ground has to be triangulated, as we were told. Okay, so since we just have one testimony, let's put it on the side. And then we just wrote about the fact that the local population were angry at the Ukrainian military because they occupied the kindergarten. That's the only thing that went through the report. Now, I don't even know in the public report whether that remained or not, because, our people in the reporting section could have thought, well, this is just people's opinion, it's not fact. So let's not publish it. I don't know if it was ever published or not. I don't know, to be frank. But this very first testimony that I heard while I was in Donbass, I mean, 4 years, 5 years down the line, I realized that how this woman was and her sister were actually very close to the truth, because the dynamics of the conflict, as I later discovered year after year, was that indeed the Ukrainian military was shelling much more than the separatist side, and they were causing many more civilian casualties than the separatist side. So that somehow vindicated this statement from the first person I talked to in Donbass. So that was very interesting symbolically. Okay, and then moving on to the other part of my discovery of the area, when I joined the human dimension in it, one of my first meetings was held with a journalist, local journalist, who wanted to see us to testify about threats he was getting on his phone. So we arranged a meeting in our base, and he showed us the messages of threats and insults he was getting on his phone. And even my interpreter at that time refused to translate the message because she said it was too rude. He said, no, I cannot translate that. It is too rude. It's against my values to say such words. So, but she was shocked. I could see it on her face. And then the guy basically told us, well, I received this kind of messages because there's a background story behind it. He said, 1 year ago, I was kidnapped uh, in, in my house by people who I didn't know who they were. My wife witnessed my being taken away, and and my wife didn't have news for several days. Instead, during 3 days, I was kept in a basement with the hood of my head, stripped naked, but a t-shirt, and subject to torture. Now, he didn't want to go into details as to what kind of torture, but when somebody is stripped naked, you can assume torture is linked to sexual abuse, right? And since it's too humiliating for men to talk about that, they prefer not to talk about it, in most of the cases. Now, I later found out from different sources, including the ICRC, different trainings that I had, that in conflict, actually, when you talk about sexual violence, the common belief in the Western world is that women are the first victims, but statistics show otherwise. Men are the first victims in the conflict victims of sexual violence, because it's a way to humiliate. It's a way to destroy the self-esteem of people, right? And so, okay, he was subjected to that like so many other people, I'm afraid. Anyways, and then, also what was interesting about his testimony that towards the end, they put a rifle in his hand, even though he still has a hood on. He said he didn't see what they would put in his hand. They put a rifle in his hand. They asked him to hold the gun, and then they say, "Okay, now we have your fingertips on the weapon. So if you don't do as we tell you, we will basically put a file against you, and you will be charged with terrorism, and you will be put in jail for the next following years." And then he was let out. Now, according to him, he was let out because his wife had spread the message around that her husband had been kidnapped. And actually, this testimony actually was confirmed even by colleagues of mine who were working in Dnipro, because the guy, we learned afterwards, he told us he was taken to Dnipro by the battalion called Dnipro 1, and volunteer battalion. And later, I had an OSCE colleague who confirmed to me, "Oh, yes, we heard about that story, we can confirm about this case." Anyways, so that was the first human rights interview that I encountered. And then this guy explained to us, "Oh, you know what, by the way, I would advise you to pay attention to the trial of the local mayor, what I'm familiar with. And it's a setup. The guy is set up. So I would advise you to follow up on that case." And so then I decided to follow up this specific case about a mayor, and which became another big part of my discovery of a judicial system in Ukraine, or in Donbass in this case, to be more accurate. And this was one of the, how can I say, most complex cases I followed while I was in Ukraine, and at the same time, one of the most revealing about how much the justice in Ukraine was a travesty of justice. It was theater. It was scandalous, honest. And this case, which I followed until the end, because there was a repeat of the trial in appeal, and then there was even a court of appeal. After the appeal, there was a new trial, a third trial that started. This time it was in Mariupol, and I also followed, several hearings at that third trial, and it was endless. And the guy I'm talking about is still under trial investigation in Ukraine, even though he escaped the country. But they put him in jail for about 3 years. And because the guys were connected, he managed to come out. And as far as I know, he's one of the very few people, the only person in Donbass that I know of, who was not sentenced in spite of 3 different trials. I mean, he was sentenced in the first 2 trials to prison sentences. And then in the court of cassation in Kyiv, he actually got a judgment that basically broke the judgment, but that decision asked for the trial to restart from start. So it was not a decision that made him innocent. It was like kind of, this weird decision. So they restarted the trial from scratch because they couldn't just admit that they would be wrong. And this guy, what was very interesting about this guy, it was very clear he was blackmailed by the SBU. He said it in the first instant court. He asked the judges, "Please look in my computer, because I have saved all the messages of threats that I received." And in those days, they refused to look at the computer, or they claimed the data was deleted. Of course, it suited them. But then in the appeal trial, the defendant made the same plea. "Please look in my computer, because there is the proof over there that I was set up." And I perfectly remember sitting in the courtroom back then, and the judge asked the prosecutor, "What do you think about this claim from the defendant that there are messages of the SBU?" They didn't say that, but messages of threat that the defendant received. They said, "Oh, this is groundless. We didn't find any evidence of that." So the prosecutor said, "I'm against checking the computer because we believe there's nothing to be found." And the judge, I was surprised because he decided to go against the opinion of a prosecutor, which was quite unusual at that time in Donbass. And so in front of the whole room, there was a giant screen behind the judges, and everybody could see as live, as the clerk was searching the computer on the indications of the defendant. He just told in which file they could find the messages of threats. And in the end, they actually showed these messages of threats on the screen. And these messages were proof that the guy was right when he said he was blackmailed from the start. And the messages, they showed even the phone number that was used and the date. And then the judge asked the prosecutor, so what about these messages? What do you think about that? I mean, did you find these messages? Do you think, maybe you should investigate like who this phone number belongs to? And the prosecutor said, oh, no, we don't think this is linked to the case. We don't think there's any need to go behind to search who is behind this phone number. And that was the end of it. And my interpreter sitting next to me, who was very pro-Ukrainian, she was one of the most pro-Ukrainian interpreters we had in Kramatorsk. And when she saw all of this, she said, "Oh, they cannot sentence this guy after that. It's not possible. This is so obvious that he was set up. I mean, the whole case should fall down from that moment." Because basically the case was that the messages were telling him, pay us some money or you will have troubles. That was it. And then they sent a second message after he refused to respond to the first one. And then the guy asked people in the police, who does that number belong to? And the police told him, this number belongs to the SBU. Right? And so it's obvious when the judge asked the prosecutor, well, who's behind that number? The prosecutor answers, well, there's no need to look who's behind it because they know who's behind it. But they are not going to expose the SBU in front of everyone. So they say, oh no, there's nothing there. There's nothing to be found. So they deny completely any reason to look behind it. So, and then, in spite of all of this, the sentence was confirmed 100%. Every statement from the first instance court was confirmed in appeal. As if, the discovery of the threats against the guy, the fact that he was set up, were counting for nothing. And there was no request from the judge to investigate who was behind the threats. They just let it go. I mean, this shows the level of absurdity, of mockery of this Ukrainian justice system, And it's just one case among 25 cases that I followed in Donbass. And almost every single one of them was scandalous of what I saw. I mean, there's in all these trials, there were elements at some point where you ask yourself, well, wait a minute, this goes beyond this defies common sense, this defies decency. In some cases, it was so obvious that the evidence was forged against the accused, but it didn't change the result. They were sentenced anyways. So, my discovery of a Ukrainian judicial system made me understand that the whole system was crooked, corrupted, morally corrupted, financially corrupted. This was not worthy of a democracy at all. And what I saw in Kramatorsk, I saw in Slavyansk, and then I saw in Mariupol multiple times, because this is in Mariupol that I attended the most hearings. And then I also witnessed trials against members of the armed forces of Ukraine, usually Azov people in Mariupol, who were accused of the most serious crimes, such as murder, torture, all these things. And from the information I got, when people were sentenced, they were sentenced to the very light sentences, even though the accusations against them was very serious, as I just said. I even discovered that one guy who was accused of Azov commander, he was an officer. He was a company commander back then in Mariupol when he was arrested. He was arrested for kidnapping some young inhabitants who were accused of drug dealings. And they decided to torture these young guys who were like 18 or 19, very young. And one of these young guys just died on the spot under the treatment that these guys were imposing on him. And there were like 3 Azov guys torturing the guy. And then one of the 3, thought they went too far. And he said, well, listen, guys, we went too far. But the 2 others didn't like it, and they shot him. So they wounded their own colleague who said we went too far by killing a young guy, just for doing drug dealings. I mean, you can be against drug dealing, but in a civilized country, you don't kidnap people in the street and do your own justice. You don't do street justice in a civilized country. You don't do that in our democracy, right? So, and okay, so when they were judge and jury, so they killed the guy. So, anyways, the story came out because the third guy who was wounded lodged a complaint against his two former colleagues. So they had to organize a trial based on that. And in this case, it was colleagues of mine who followed the trials. But since I had a coordinating function, I was like compiling all the different reports on the court hearings that we had. And I was putting that in an Excel tables, and I was following all the trials we had in Mariupol, even those I didn't personally attend it. I knew what was going on because of the compilation of this data. And in the end, I found out that one of the two accused of torture and murder, he ended up being higher in rank in Azov, and he became battalion commander in Azov. And I saw him later on being interviewed on one of the biggest Ukrainian YouTube channels under the code name of Rolo, which is like a Viking hero. And I realized it was the same guy. I double checked his name from according to our data, and the data of a guy, and I realized it was the same guy. And instead of being jailed, the guy was just basically promoted. So when I left Mariupol, I don't know how this trial ended, if the guy was ever sentenced to any prison sentence at all. But what I see is that, okay, a couple of years later, he's just being promoted within the Azov battalion. So to torture and kill people pays in the system. So it shows, I mean, the moral decay of the Ukraine that I saw. And who knows about that? Who talks about that? No one. And we had all this information, and unfortunately, I'm one of the very few to have that much knowledge because I worked in different bases. And many people in my mission, they only worked in one base. They only knew what was going on in their own bases. And even my colleagues in Mariupol, we were just like 6 or 7 people within the human dimension unit knowing what was going on. The others didn't have a clue. So that was also a big problem. And the people in the hierarchy above us, they would never publish our reports because they were only interested in facts like, okay, that person accused of this crime was sentenced to that amount of years in prison, and that's it. That's all that was published of what we were collecting. The background story, they were not interested. They only published the final decision, and that did not give any idea of how unreliable the whole process was. Now, we had a legal cell within the human dimension in the headquarters. We were sending them all a detailed report, but I never saw that they did anything concrete with this data. So this was basically, filed without any consequence.
So that
So
means,
that's what
let me ask, let me ask, that means, Benoit, that the OSCE did not report the experiences on the ground accurately, but gave the whole thing a bias. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, there was so many information that we collected as part of the human dimension that was never published anywhere. Well, actually, the thing we were doing that was the most useful is they were sharing information with the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission that was also in Ukraine, because they were specialized in human rights, and they're there to publish more information than we did about all these human rights violations. But we, in the OSCE mission, hardly published anything in this regard. Um, and it was like a decision from a hierarchy that some things were too sensitive to be published, and there was this argument that we had to protect our sources, protect the people who came to talk to us. So we had even for the most serious cases, we had a separate reporting mechanism. It didn't even go through the usual reporting mechanism, under the pretext that we had to protect the people, and which, to be honest, was a good reason in many cases. We were right to protect the people. It's according to the do no harm principle, because whoever they were complaining about, if the people they were complaining about, if they had known, they could then do organized reprisals against these people who came to talk to us. So indeed, unfortunately, this was part of the dilemma that we had. But even though there was this moral dilemma, I thought there's so much going on that we cannot just keep silent about it. We have to let the world know that this is going on. But we didn't do it. Okay, were just consolating ourselves with the fact that we actually managed to give some information to the United Nations. But then the reports of the United Nations about the human rights violations, they try to do the same thing as us, like to do something balanced. But there was not many details in those reports. And I read a few of them. But who was reading them? Honestly, I never saw anything that the UN reported about that was blaming Ukraine. I never saw that being used in the Western press. Never. Maybe it happened. I don't have like a universal knowledge, but I've never seen evidence of it. So the Western press, as far as I'm aware, they only collected data that fed the Russian aggression narrative, right? If the data showed human rights violation on the side of Ukraine, then that is not something the Western politicians or the Western mainstream press was interested in, unfortunately. Now, there could have been at some point in the early days reports about, war crimes committed by volunteer battalions, but I haven't seen much evidence about that, honestly. So even when a French reporter from Canal Plus network, he did a documentary in 2016 called "The Hidden Mask of the Revolution," which showed the ugly side of the Ukrainian nationalist. Notably, he talked a lot about the massacre of Odessa on the 2nd of May 2014. And he was violently attacked by most of the mainstream journalists in France. They told him that he did a very lousy job, that he misrepresented facts and people, and that this was unacceptable. And everyone who tried to propose a different narrative was violently attacked. And this guy afterwards, he stopped talking about Ukraine, as far as I know, because he was attacked too violently. And so the truth never came out about what was going on. So this is what motivated me to write my book, because I realized, okay, well, so many people know the real extent of the war crimes committed by Ukrainian units, but also how unreliable, biased the Ukrainian justice system was, unworthy of a democracy. And when I hear that, since 2022, Ukraine, is like the defender of democracy against Russian barbarism. I mean, this is so contrary to what I saw on the ground. I mean, I'm not talking about Russia here, because I've never worked in Russia. I don't know, uh, how Russia respects or does not respect human rights. I'm not going to repeat what other people say, because I haven't seen with my own eyes. So I'm not saying Russia is a model in terms of respect of human rights. I cannot say it because I haven't seen it. It was not my job to talk about that. My job was to monitor human rights, respect of human rights in Ukraine, not in Russia. So I cannot talk about Russia. I can talk about Ukraine. And what I saw in Ukraine, as I said in my book, what I saw in Ukraine was scary. That's what I wanted to say. What's the message I wanted to convey. So all these people who defend Ukraine on social networks, who say, "Oh, Ukraine is the camp of good, right? Fighting evil. We should defend it because it's a democracy against dictatorship, against authoritarianism." But this is not what I saw in Ukraine. That's the thing. What I saw is a country that attacked its own citizens in Donbass. This is another dimension of it. Because of the heavy shelling that Ukrainian forces did on Donbass, I also later on made statistics about civilian casualties. I said that in multiple interviews already. But the statistics showed that 72% of the victims of shelling in Donbass between 2016 and 2018 were on the separatist side, in other terms caused by Ukraine. 72%. And I also made statistics on the Lugansk Oblast, because then I was deployed there. And if you considered damages to infrastructure, which was a different category, we know we were verifying every allegation of damages to houses, buildings, and stuff. And systematically, we were doing that work. And I was in charge of coordinating that in Lugansk for the Lugansk Oblast as a whole. And at some point, we were asked to do statistics. I did those statistics. And it showed that 75% of all the confirmed damages to infrastructure that we collected as a mission on both sides, it was on the separatist side. So between the civilian casualties and the damages to infrastructure, we had two statistics that matched, 72 versus 75%, which is tangible evidence that Ukraine was shelling much more than the separatist side. Again, going back to the testimony of that first person I met in Kodomivka, who said that the Ukrainians were shelling randomly as compared to the separatists. You see? So yeah, this is like my main discoveries while I was working in Donbass, and I felt it was important to share this information because many of it is firsthand. Very few people know about it, including the OSCE mission where I worked. And I thought, when the world is on the brink of World War III, this has to be known.
So let me ask, did the OSCE perform as a traitor of its own principles?
I consider that the OSCE betrayed its own mandate. Simple as that. Especially regarding the fact that we refused to publish statistics about the civilian casualties, because that was very telling about the dynamics of the conflict. It was a central issue in the narrative of Ukrainian government shelling its own citizens in Donbass versus Russian aggression coming to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians who would all support the Ukrainian government. This is a completely false narrative. Completely. I think Russia supported the separatists in one way or another. But to blame all the dead in Donbass on Russia alone is just so far from the truth. Most of the people who died in Donbass were caused by Ukrainian. It's even confirmed by statistics compiled by the UN, which I also published in my book. The very end, because I found those statistics afterwards, but nobody mentioned that. Once again, and the statistics that the UN compiled said that from memory, it was like at the end of 2021 that they published these numbers. So from memory, it was like 6,000 separatist soldiers who were killed, about 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers who were killed, meaning like you had 50% more separatist soldiers killed in this conflict than Ukrainian ones, which should, again, seem to show that the Ukrainian side was shedding much more than the separatist side. And then you have the civilian casualties, but the UN did not separate civilian casualties in terms of where they were located. So we don't know on which side they were the biggest amount of civilian casualties according to their data. They just published a global figure. But okay, at least it shows in itself that you cannot blame the most of the victims of this conflict on the separatists on Russia. It's just like it's not confirmed by statistics. And the fact that OSCE refused to publish statistics, again, for me, was a betrayal of a mandate, because it let the narrative defended by Poroshenko at that time to be unopposed by facts. I wrote to my hierarchy in those days. Once I did the statistics, I wrote to my hierarchy saying, okay, we have data that can contradict a false narrative. And if we publish this data, it would help people around the world, and especially in Ukraine, to realize that the people whom they think are the aggressors, the separatists, in this case, they are mostly the victims. And if people knew that, they would have had a different understanding of the whole conflict in Donbass, and then they could have voted in Ukraine for parties that would actually not revendicate, a military solution to the conflict, but rather a diplomatic solution to it, and the implementation of Minsk agreement. But we just let Poroshenko statements being unopposed, and then the Western world behind used. Was just following the Ukrainian agenda. So we had the means to tell the truth about what's going on, and we refused to do it. To be frank, it's because we did it only once in 2017 in one report, and I mentioned that also in my book, but in previous reports. The Ukrainian government reacted with a lot of anger against our head of mission, and after that, our head of mission decided never to publish statistics about civilian casualties showing on which side we found the biggest amount of those casualties. That was the end. And this, I believe.
Who decided, Benoit, who decided inside the OSCE mission what was reported and what was not reported? What was documented?
Ultimately, it's the head of mission.
And the head of mission was under pressure.
But he was not deciding alone. He was not deciding alone, because when I requested a private meeting with him in Kyiv once in order to raise this issue about civilian casualty statistics. And he always told us, anyone is welcome to visit me. So, okay, I said, fine. I asked for a meeting, and I asked to visit him. And he listened to me politely. And afterwards, he said, okay, well, you have an interesting proposal, like to publish the statistics. But he said, I need to discuss it with my deputies. So he had to decide with the principal deputy head of mission at that time, and the head of reporting, who at that time was a German citizen, by the way. And he told me, well, just send a memo, a written memo that summarized what you told me in a written form, and send it to me and to them as well, and we'll discuss among ourselves, and we'll see what to do. So I did what I was asked to do, and nothing happened. But it's basically three people, if I follow the head of mission, who decided together not to publish the statistics.
Do you have any evidence of influence by the United States, by U.S. organizations like USAID or the CIA?
Well, the way the OSCE functions is that you have actually the headquarters of the OSCE are based in Vienna. And in Vienna, you have the delegations of all the member states that gather regularly. The OSCE has, I guess it still has, it had at that time 57 member states. Basically, all the countries from the Western Hemisphere, like in Northern Hemisphere, like United States, Canada, and all the European countries, plus the former countries of the Soviet Union. All these people are member states. All these people have a say in the affairs of the OSCE. But if you consider budget-wise, the United States has, I'm saying this figure from memory, maybe people should double check that, because it may not be 100% reliable on that. But from recollection, I think the US was basically paying 24% of the whole budget of the OSCE. Germany, France, the UK, Italy, each funded about 9%. Russia was funding less than that, as from recollection, maybe 6 or 7%, because it was based on GDP, roughly, from long ago. And for European countries, the four major European countries, well, it was decided, okay, based on GDP, it's more or less the same, right? So we all paid the same, but the US was way more influential. So of course, whatever the US said, was heavily influential throughout the OSCE. And regularly, when we were on the ground, we could read in our press digest that the U.S. delegation in Vienna was making very harsh statements against the separatists, against Russia, all the time. They were doing that all the time. And they were even spreading lies. I mean, to tell you the truth, they were spreading lies on some topics of things that happened on the ground. Everything that happened on the ground was for the US delegation a pretext to demonize the separatists and accuse Russia, even if it was cases where the Ukrainian military was shelling. I tell stories about that in my book. You know, all the evidence is there, the witnesses, multiple witnesses. And anyways, uh, this is what happened. They were constantly a propaganda machine against the separatists and the Russians, regardless of what was going on the ground. Um, so, and then inside the OSCE mission, we had many American citizens, but every country was limited to 10% of the overall staff, right? So that you wouldn't have one country dominating too much. Americans did not have very high senior positions in the mission, but they had many people on the ground. And what I saw is that at some point when I was working in Kramatorsk, one of the newcomers I had discussed with him, the guy was a former employee of the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is now known, among people who know things, at least, that this is just an NGO that was created in the 80s to replace functions that were before then implemented by the CIA, right? But now, what the CIA used to do to influence politics in foreign countries, the NED was doing it. So, and that guy, he told me proudly that he had worked for, I think, 5 years for the NED in Ukraine. And then he joined our mission. And at some point, because in my function, I had some coordinating function once again when I was in Kramatorsk. And so I was reading a lot of reports. And again, this is why I know more than most of my colleagues, because most of my colleagues who were just mere monitors didn't have as much access to data that I had, because as part of my coordinating functions, I had to read reports written by others to make weekly summaries of that. So, and at some point, as I was in charge of the Human Dimension Weekly Summary, I was reading through all the reports compiled by our reporting unit based on patrol reports. And at some point, I saw there was a discrepancy, something that didn't make sense. Basically, in that report, it was described that one village on the Ukrainian control side was shelled, and that as a result of the shelling, 5 different houses had been damaged in that village, confirmed by us, the OSCE. But at the same time, further down the report, it was said that the local mayor of that municipality, it was, I think, Novoluhanske, the name of the municipality, is north of Tolovka. The local mayor, when we visited her, our OSCE patrol said, oh, there's no damages in our village. Nobody was injured, no damages. So I said, wait a minute. How can we confirm that 5 houses are damaged and then the local mayor says there are no damages? This is a contradiction here. So I asked the head of a reporting cell, well, can you please give me access to the initial patrol report that mentions that? Because I don't understand this discrepancy. And so we together, he was another American guy, by the way, a retired diplomat, a nice guy. So, and I was standing next to him while he was searching the computer to look for the initial patrol reports where the raw data was written. And then we actually found out together that the data about the damaged houses was not about Luhansk. It was about the municipality on the other side of the line of contact, Gorlovka. Gorlovka, that was held by the separatists. So in other terms, a report confirming that the separatists were victims of a shelling became a report in which the separatists were blamed for a shelling on the Ukrainian control side. It was a complete reversal of responsibility. I mean, how can you do that? And it was like, blatant proof. So then, of course, I changed my report accordingly, right? But it was a weekly report, and the way our mission worked, we had daily reports which were public, and then we had a weekly report. But the weekly report was not made public. It was only made to be read by the 57 member states. So, anyways, whatever we would correct would only be in the weekly report from the member states. Journalists would not see it. Anyways, once the report is published, I have never seen one of our daily reports being corrected because of something wrong in it. Maybe it happened, but I'm not aware of it. Anyways, that report with wrong information was probably published, and well, I don't think there was any correction. I'm not aware. Anyways, after that, we confronted this guy in the office, and all he had to say, the guy who wrote the summary report of the day, he said, "Oh, well, sorry, it's a human mistake. I was under stress because of time pressure. You know how it is. We have to go fast and blah blah blah." I said, "Okay, all our reporting officers basically are under the same stress every single day to compile the daily report of their own days quickly, because these reports are awaited in higher up echelons. But how can you justify that you made a human mistake by changing the name of the village where the shelling took place, or village of locality in this place, because Golovka is not a village? It doesn't. No one will believe that. Even a child would not believe that. So the answer was that all human mistakes, and that's the only answer he could give in order to justify what happened. But who believes it, honestly, right? But okay, he could save face to a certain level, and that was it. I discovered blatant case of falsification of a report. Now, how many more reports were falsified based on this example that nobody saw but me after it was published? I really wondered. And then I had testimonies from other colleagues, two other colleagues, who told me that they also had evidence of reports that were falsified in Kyiv. And one of these testimonies was, again, a guy who was the patrol leader who wrote the initial report. So he perfectly knew what he wrote. And then when the report was published, the published report, he saw that they changed what he wrote. Because at some point he said, "Oh, we heard gunfire," but they couldn't tell where the direction of the gunfire. And in the report that was published, it was translated by gunfire from the separatist side, which he said, "I never wrote that." But somebody higher up added that, and then he made his own investigation, and he found out that the reporting officer who actually was responsible for the mission report that day. We could know that.
That, Benoit, that means that the OSCE reports followed the propaganda narrative of the West and of the coup government in Kiev by falsifications and by lying through leaving out.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say the lying was like every day in a systematic way. I wouldn't say that. But there were cases of falsification of reports, which I just mentioned. And in the two cases that I know of where reports were falsified, we find two U.S. citizens. And these U.S. citizens who is responsible for this second case that I just mentioned, I found out later on that she was a woman, and I was told by a reliable source who got it from other American citizens that she was actually dating an SBU officer, right? So someone who is in charge of the reports of the OSCE at the highest level in the headquarters, someone who is in charge of a public report that everybody will see, that person is dating an SBU officer, and in a mission where we're supposed to be neutral. I mean, if it had been the other way around, you could be sure that that person would have been fired immediately. But because it's, somebody dating, the right side, well, it's okay. I even saw the case was in Kramatorsk. One of our interpreters was married to an SBU officer. and she was working with us. And then I realized, damn it, how can we trust her? But the management thought, oh, it's okay.
Okay, Benoit, according to the New York Times, had the CIA 12 secret stations in eastern Ukraine after the coup of Maidan. Did you know that in that time you were a monitor?
No, I didn't have information about that, to be frank. I only discovered about this later on in the press, but I had no evidence of this while I was there.
And there is in German press a typical narrative that Russian military invaded the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014. Did you see any evidence that Russian troops were on the ground?
No, that was the thing that many people were looking for. I had colleagues who were obsessed with that, to be honest. Western colleagues, of course. But we never found evidence in our case. I never saw it anywhere that there were confirmed Russian troops in Donbass. Doesn't mean that there were none, but we didn't see any evidence of it. Even during my first day in training, when we were training in Kyiv, uh, the guy who was then the head of the human dimension unit, he told us that in those days there was a story in the Ukrainian press about two Russian citizens whom they said were Russian soldiers working somewhere I guess in Donbass, and that they arrested. This guy told us, well, actually, we, as a mission, we didn't have a chance to talk to them, so we cannot confirm what the Ukrainian side is saying, that they are Russian soldiers. The Russian, okay, and that's basically how he presented things. We cannot confirm it because we didn't talk to them. So that was just a claim from the Ukrainian government. Now, maybe it was true, but again, we didn't see the evidence, as far as I'm aware. And I remember a colleague of mine who told me, oh yeah, at some point we went in a village in the DPR side, and the officer was very polite and properly dressed. So I'm sure this is a sign that this was a Russian officer in a Russian unit. And that was enough for the guy to be convinced this was the Russian unit, because the guy was polite and well dressed. Yes, sorry, but I don't find it convincing. And it's not proof for me. And I myself experienced that. You go to different units in the DPR, and you see different levels of discipline from one unit to another, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily Russians. Every time that I could, I asked people where they were from, see what they would answer. And of course, I never found somebody who told me I'm from Russia. Well, one case, actually, one guy said he came from Russia, but he said, I am a Ukrainian who used to live in Russia, and I decided to come back to defend uh, my own country, which in his mind, the Donbass. And that was it. Once I met a guy who said he was from Moldova, but he just volunteered to join the separatist side. That's the another time. I know I was with a Georgian colleague of mine, and we found a Georgian soldier wearing the uniform. But my colleague recognized he had a Georgian accent by talking to him, and so then he told me, "Oh yeah, he's Georgian." I knew it immediately when he talked. So then he got confirmation of it. But okay, he was just actually he was from Abkhazia, because the guy decided to stop and ask him specifically where he was from, and he said he was from Abkhazia, which is one of the separatist region of Georgia, as we know. So, but again, I never found evidence of Russian people being there. Once I asked the manager of the hotel where we were accommodated in Golovka controlled by the separatists, I asked him the question, are there Russian soldiers here? And he said, well, I don't know. But he said, if there were, I'm pretty sure you would never find them, because they would be discreet and they would be technical advisors, this kind of people.
Do you have, Benoit, do you have any evidence that the separatists in Lugansk and Donetsk received weapons, machine guns, tanks, artillery, things like that from the Russian side?
I wouldn't say, I mean, I haven't seen evidence of it myself. But, I was not specialized in this part. So I cannot tell you, oh, there was zero proof that, there was military equipment and ammunition from Russia that came to Donbass. To be honest, I would be surprised if it was not the case. I mean, since the conflict lasted for so long, I would assume that Russian side find ways to channel ammunitions and even weapons to the separatists, so that they would actually survive. I wouldn't be surprised about that. But the thing is, I haven't seen at my level evidence of it, and I'm not aware that the OSCE found evidence of it. But again, I want to be cautious on that. I don't have universal knowledge necessarily on this issue because I was not specialized on it. So, so I'll remain cautious about it.
But you worked as a OSCE monitor until the Russian invasion in 2022. Just in the month and the weeks before this invasion, did you have seen any escalation from the Ukraine side, a boosting of shelling, a massive troop amount, or something else?
Well, actually, I talked about it pretty lengthily in my book towards the end, because I would say, like, you shouldn't consider this issue only on the side of ceasefire violations and shelling. I think it is my opinion that Ukraine provoked the Russian intervention. And why I say that, because I followed all the events in 2021 that led to this. Again, maybe too long to explain here, but there was a series of decisions made by Zelensky and his administration as soon as Biden was inaugurated, late January 2021. Then there was an acceleration in Ukraine of a radical nationalist agenda. It started with, basically closing down major television channels in Ukraine, the three of them, on the pretext that they were spreading Russian propaganda. And, in those days, just to support the Minsk agreement or to support the use of a Russian language was spreading Russian propaganda, So they were closed from one day to the next by a presidential decree. So much for the Ukrainian democracy. And we are talking about big channels that everyone knew in Ukraine. And they were owned by deputy of the Rada, the parliament, which was close to Medvedchuk, the head of the national opposition bloc party, which was perfectly legal in Ukraine at that moment. But they decided to attack them. And just a few days later, Zelensky and his administration decided to issue an arrest warrant against Medvedchuk and his main how can I say, lieutenant, who was the owner of the television channels. So both of them were charged with high treason under what I consider to be fake charges when you read about the case, but it could be too long to explain. So that was, an attempt to silence your main opponents, because in those days, Medvedchuk was like in the polls. He could gather 20% of the vote Ukraine-wide in case of a presidential elections. I remember reading that. And nobody, even Poroshenko, was below that. There was no other politician in Ukraine with such a high approval rate in the opposition, because the opposition was very divided. So that was a second very important case. And then in March, Zelensky signed another decree in which they basically described all the measures Ukraine would take when they would take over Crimea. And it was mentioned in the document, in the decree, that they would consider all kinds of options to retake Crimea, including military one. So, I mean, it was like the biggest provocation they could actually come up with to provoke Russia, right? Uh, and then there was continuous talks about, Ukraine joining NATO. The Biden administration was constantly talking about it, like Ukraine had a right to join NATO. You could not prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It was just a matter of time. And then there was even like strategic agreements signed between the U.S. and Ukraine, both in September, and then another one in November. With I read, the main parts of these defense agreements, strategic agreements, and there was heavily talking about defense issues. And we've learned afterwards, but as part of these agreements, there were secret weapons deliveries organized. Blinken acknowledged it. So the Russians could see that building up. And he also in Donbass in October, the Ukrainian forces decided to kidnap an unarmed LPR, Lugansk People's Republic, observer. He was a military observer, and they were supposed to observe the withdrawal of armed people and weapons along the line of contact in some designated areas. And for the first time ever, the Ukrainian forces decided to kidnap one of these guys, accusing him of spying. Which again, I think it's from what I read about the case, I think this is groundless. And that made the LPR people furious against the OSCE. And there was very mild reaction from us and from the Western states, just to say, well, we never criticized Ukraine about anything while I was working over there. I never heard the smallest criticism about Ukraine about anything, just to say it bluntly, for all these years. In spite of, so Ukraine thought basically they could do whatever they wanted. They had carte blanche, and the West would never complain. And then, it was in those same period, November 2021, Russia published diplomatic telegrams it had exchanged with both Germany and France about the Minsk agreement. And in those exchanges, Russia was asking France and Germany to put pressure on Ukraine to finally have a direct channel of communication with the separatists to implement the Minsk agreement, because all the time since 2015, the Ukrainian side refused to talk directly to the separatists. So they would only talk to the Russians or to OSCE. So when there were negotiations in Minsk, it was like kind of a theater. The Ukrainian delegation would talk to OSCE representatives or to Russians directly, and then the OSCE would talk to the separatists. And then the separatists would mention their points, and then the OSCE would carry the points to the Ukrainian side. It was like this, childish games, you could say, like so much waste of time with these games. Because Ukrainian side said, oh, we don't want to talk to the puppets, we want to talk to the master puppets, the Russians. But the Russians wanted to disengage from that. So it was like constant, disagreement back and forth, and hardly anything of substance when moving on throughout these years. And so I think the Russian side was tired of all these things. They could see that the Minsk agreement were going nowhere. So they asked one last time, I believe, France and Germany, godfathers of the agreement, can you please do something about it? And once France and Germany again said, no, we will not pressure Ukraine to talk to the separatists, Ukraine does whatever it wants. That's basically what France and Germany said. Then for the Russians, it was like a way to say, okay, the Minsk agreements are dead, right? There's nothing to revive in it. We're not going anywhere, it's just a waste of time. And so, but in spite of that, then Macron and I think Merkel was out already. So I guess it was, sorry, I forgot the name of your chancellor, who's not out now, Olaf Scholz. So it was, I guess, Scholz back then, because I think, as I recall, Merkel stepped down in December 21, but you should know that better than me. So they tried to resume some talks about the Minsk agreement in January and February, but I was convinced it wouldn't lead anywhere. It was just a show. And of course, it led nowhere, as expected, because there was no will to implement that. And then now, No, Macron says, oh, it was the Russian side that basically, in the end, killed the Minsk agreement by recognizing DPR and LPR, first of all, 21st of February. So that basically puts an end to the Minsk agreement de facto, or de jure, I should say. But de facto, they were dead long before, and everything else was just a show, you know. So yeah, so all they're saying, this is like the political side of a buildup that led to the war. Now, if you talk about only the what can I say, the military side of things, we know the OSCE mission confirmed it. From 16th February, there was a harsh increase of ceasefire violations in Donbass from the 16th. But, I know how OSCE compiled the statistics about ceasefire violations because I was part of that myself. I was even having a dialogue with the person in charge of it for many years because he was another Frenchman. And we knew each other pretty well. So I had a lot of debates with him about, the how to make this reporting more efficient and all the weaknesses of the system. And he was perfectly aware of the weaknesses of the system. But at some point, he stepped down in those because he had spent too many years working with OSCE and he reached his limit. So then somebody else replaced him. But I'm not aware that the system changed fundamentally after that. Anyways, the statistic only shows an amount of ceasefire violations. It doesn't show who's shelling whom. That's the big flow of these statistics. And then it shows locations of explosions. But another problem about this reporting system, though, when you report an explosion, it doesn't confirm whether it's an outgoing or incoming explosion. This is based on the feeling of the monitors, but I know for a fact that this is largely subjective. Whether it's outcoming and incoming, you can only realize when you're close. If you're not close, it's very hard to tell. And even people can be convinced about something, but they can be wrong. This is this human, it's based on human perception about something which is not scientifically provable. So the only reliable statistics about ceasefire violations are the data collected by night vision cameras. Because the night vision cameras, they publish images, and you can analyze these images because you see the shells flying, basically. Because the shells have how's the word in English? Well, there's like light connected to the shell. I just forget right now. It's not flares. It's anyway. It's another expression. Tracing. Okay, tracing, either tracing bullets or tracing shells. You can see them in the sky. When I was like myself observing, ceasefire violations at night, when I was deployed in Gorlovka or deployed in Svetlodarsk on the other side, it's very easy to tell where things come from and where they go if you know the geography. And so we had installed cameras on the line of contact to document that at night because we couldn't be there physically, except for a couple of places. And I focused on analyzing this data because it was in the annex of all the OSCE reports. But actually, I didn't do this analysis when it occurred. I waited until I wrote my own book. I had downloaded all the data and I waited until I did my own book. Okay, now let's look at it in detail, see what the data shows. And then I discovered that the data showed that each time we had filmed who was shelling whom, it was, in the vast majority of cases, the Ukrainian side starting with fire exchange and shelling much more than the separatist side. This was like proof. But nobody mentions that. So I thought I had to report about it in my book.
Under which circumstances did you leave Ukraine in 2022?
Well, at that moment, I was based in Odessa, but I had access to OSCE reports, right? So including at that moment, I was like downloading the official mission report that we did. And when I had a doubt about something, I could call my colleagues in Donbass, which I did once. But Odessa itself was shelled by the Russian missiles. It's starting from very early on the 24th, but I was living near the port, so I didn't hear anything. But my colleagues were living more towards the center, and they were all awakened by the huge explosions, which were at the level of the airport, Odessa airport. And then I got awakened rather early by somebody in my office who said, "Hey, did you hear the explosion?" I said, "No, what explosions?" And then he told me, "Well, it just started." I mean, this is the first page of my book, by the way. I started to write my book about how I was woken and awakened on 24th February by a colleague of mine who told me it has started before talking about um, explosions. It has started. And I immediately knew what he was talking about because the issue of Russian invasion of Ukraine, everybody was talking about it for like the couple of months before. And because in Odessa I was in charge of political affairs, I had decided to ask this question to all my contacts in the political parties in the Odessa scene, in the regional council or in the municipal council. I was trying to figure out what do people think about this issue, about the Russian threat. And it was very interesting to see what they would say. Anyways, it's another topic. It's in my book for those interested. But okay, we knew it could happen any day. So I was not surprised. And then he said, okay, come to the office, just bring one bag and be prepared to be evacuated. I said, oh, okay. And it was bad news for me because, I mean, in various ways, because, you understood that you were entering unknown territory at that moment. You know how wars start. You never know how they end. And I was feeling like we were like living something comparable to World War II. Like
Thank you very
massive
much.
offensives. Yeah,
Thank you very
all of a
much,
sudden you
Benoit.
feel okay. We are going to relive what our grandparents lived: massive
Mhm.
military offensive, massive war of an unknown scale since World War II in Europe.
Benoît Paré, thank you very much for this talk.
Mhm.
Benoît Paré, ein OSCE-Beobachter im Donbass von 2015 bis 2022, sagt, was ich im Kriegsgebiet gesehen habe, unterscheidet sich erheblich von der westlichen Propaganda. Wir bei Gegen den Strom zeigen Positionen und Perspektiven, die die Propagandamedien verschweigen.